Hi, I'm Amanda McKay. I'm a professional artist and I'm making these videos to help people enhance their creativity, and these tips are meant for everybody at any level of expertise. For this tip, I want to talk about if you're ready to dig a little bit deeper in your creative practice, how you can use your emotions to help you create more powerful work. And I do want to start out by saying that this isn't meant to be a substitute for therapy for yourself, even though it can be very cathartic to create art that's exploring your emotions. So if you really are struggling with trauma or mental health, I do recommend seeing a therapist and not just opening yourself to very painful emotions to create art. But if this is something that you feel like you're able to do safely, even if it maybe brings up uncomfortable feelings, and maybe it brings up positive feelings, as I'll get into in a moment, just going into any sort of emotion at all will usually tend to resonate in the whatever piece you've created. And if you show it to anybody or anybody reads it, on some subconscious level at least, it will speak to them in a different way, basically. So I'll start out by using an example of my own work. I'm predominantly an oil painter, and I paint still lifes of assembled natural objects. And when I first started painting these still lifes, they were mostly satirical and slightly humorous still lifes that were about American culture and different things that I found kind of funny about it. But then everything changed after about 6 months. I read a news article, and it's been a long time, so I'm pretty sure that the country where this happened was Egypt. But it was somewhere in the Middle East, and basically there had been protesters, and there was a big group of people, and it was both men and women, and the protests lasted overnight and then into the next day. And so in other words, in this big crowd of people, there were men and there were women, and they weren't all married to each other, and they were standing around in a group together. So apparently the government wanted to make sure that the women were pure. They didn't care about the men, but all the women that were around, they subjected to virginity tests, and the article I read didn't say what exactly that involved, except that it sounded like it was very invasive and degrading and probably not very accurate when all is said and done. But this made me extremely angry. I felt that it was very unfair because the men, nobody cared whether the men were pure, and it was only about the women. And in my anger, I was trying to decide that morning what I was going to paint next, and I decided somehow I was going to paint about this topic. I felt like nobody was going to really be talking about it. I don't even know how I came across that article, but this was not just strangers in a foreign land, this was actual women who were subjected to these tests. So I wound up creating a painting about it called Virginity Test, and I wound up making a series of paintings, and I feel like this took my art to a new level, because instead of just having surface emotions and saying like, oh, like wink wink, look at this that we do in America, it was about something really traumatic to the people who had experienced it. And I wound up using a hawk's feather to basically stab a strawberry. The strawberry was used to represent the feminine, and even though it didn't show any people or any victims, it did have a sense of violence about it. And I think that my anger came through, and it really did take my art to the next level, and I started creating more activist art after that. And nobody that I showed the piece to was aware that this had happened. So it did put this more front of mind for everybody. I mean, there wasn't really a whole lot I could have done since this was a foreign government, but I thought at least I could do something to let everybody know what had happened, and that this is something we need to, at the very least, watch out for in our own country, that we don't go in this direction and have it happening to all of us. So it was my piece of protest art, and then I wound up I'm still doing protest art. I think that was probably 15 years ago. But this piece really resonated with people because it had such a stronger emotion than my earlier work. So I will give a few more examples. They don't have to be as negative or intense as these emotions that I'm talking about. And it was cathartic to paint it, and it did make me feel less angry because I felt like I was at least doing something that I could do using my own skill set, which didn't really involve convincing a foreign government to change their ways. But it was the small thing that I felt like I could do, and the only thing I could do in this situation. And like I said, try to make it where people in my own country are aware of this and don't let it happen to all of us. So to use some other examples that you might have in your art that would not be very negative emotions like this, might be, okay, let's say you're a landscape painter and you want to paint the Grand Canyon. Well, there's been tons of images, whether paintings, drawings, photos of the Grand Canyon, and that it is a very impressive and colorful and beautiful thing to look at. But instead of just working on, if you're painting it, instead of just thinking about the shapes and the colors that you see, what emotions would the Grand Canyon make you feel? Does it make you feel a sense of awe and wonder and majesty? Or maybe you hiked one of the trails and it filled you with fear and you didn't realize that you were afraid of heights until that moment when you looked down and like thousands of feet down and realized how high up you were. So let's say that you have this sort of healthy fear that you felt when you were in the canyon. Well, you might you might paint something or photograph something that's at an angle where you're kind of looking down into it in a way that highlights this, this kind of like, oh my God, I'm so high up feeling, because it seems like a lot of artwork that I see about the canyon is all just trying to show how vast it is and how huge, but it would be a totally different result if you were trying to show how scary it can be by looking down one of those drops. Another example I can think of would be, let's say you like to cook or bake, and you think about meals that you had in your past, and do they bring up nostalgia? Maybe your grandmother made you a birthday cake once, and she used a special recipe, and maybe you just want to recreate that recipe and have this feeling of nostalgia. Maybe you can use it as kind of a jumping off point. Maybe there are some ingredients in it that, like vegetable shortening, that you feel are really unhealthy, and so you want to kind of modernize the recipe, but you're starting from a place of nostalgia and wanting to kind of recreate that feeling of being loved by your family. Maybe there was a meal that your parents would make for you if you had a bad day, and it's a feeling of comfort, and then you're thinking, okay, well, what's something that I could make, a recipe I could come up with, even if it's just a twist on whatever my parents used to cook, that would kind of give me that same kind of feeling of comfort. And maybe you grew up in poverty and you didn't get to eat out at a restaurant very often, but you did a couple times a year for a very special occasion, and you would go to this French restaurant perhaps, and you had this feeling of abundance and celebration and success when you would eat something in that restaurant. So maybe you want to kind of recreate what would be a recipe you could come up with that would make you feel that sense of abundance or success. And of course, you can just be cooking something to just make you, to help keep you alive, keep your family alive, because obviously you have to eat. But you might come up with something even better if you're trying to come at it from this angle of some sort of emotion that you're trying to recreate by making this new recipe. So tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced this. I think if you're a songwriter or a writer of any sort, you probably are more likely to deal with emotions, but there are other things like cooking where I think it's not as common. So let me know in the comments if you've ever done this, or maybe you give this a try with something where you hadn't really thought about infusing it with emotion. and let me know how that works out for you, and if you think that this will take your creative practice to a different level, or maybe you disagree completely. But either way, I would welcome your feedback, so let me know. And I hope you found this tip to be useful. Again, my name is Amanda McKay, and thank you so much for watching.